On Thursday, the White House says there is still no final decision on any way forward.
We're looking very, very seriously, very closely at that whole situation, and we'll see what happens, folks. We'll see what happens. It's too bad that the world puts us in a position like that.
NBC's Hans Nichols is live at the Pentagon. Hans, we're waiting on news from the White House. What's the latest messaging from the Pentagon?
The messaging this morning, Stephanie, is that nothing is imminent. Officials have had their first intel briefings here, their first updates. Nothing seems like it's immediately on the table. Now, that says, in the word of one official, things are quiet until they're not. But what we heard all day yesterday was really two notes of caution, and you heard the Secretary of Defense explicitly say this. Number one, there's this difference between evidence and proof of a chemical attack and just what kind of chemicals are used. As you mentioned, there's certainty inside the U.S. government that they have evidence. But proving it, especially at the UN, is a different matter. And then the other big question here, and you heard even more caution from Secretary Mattis on this, is if the U.S. does take a strike against Syria, how can they control what they call here the escalation ladder?
All right, I want to bring in retired four-star General Barry McCaffrey, an MSNBC military analyst, and Danielle Pletka, the Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. General, to you first. We just heard Defense Secretary James Mattis cautious about any kind of military response in Syria. Do you share those concerns?
Oh, yeah. You know, there's no question. I have a great deal of empathy for the national security leadership on this one. We must make a strong statement against chemical weapons. They're not very effective against prepared, trained U.S. military forces. Against defenseless civilians, they're horrific. We can't allow that to become normalized behavior. But at the same time, as you look at the ground, we got Russian and Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah forces and Turkish units inside Syria. We got to be careful to not have this turn into a wider regional war.
Then if you were advising the president, what would you suggest he do?
I think where we are now, we need to write down a political strategy. There need to be allies, hopefully to include Arabs. We need to not just have a target list that we've decided to strike. I do believe we're going to have to take military action against the Syrian armed forces elements that are involved in chemical weapons. And it ought to be a painful one. But we need to get into the Russians and say, let's not have this turn into a confrontation between us and them. And by the way, Mattis may well be waiting for more U.S. military power to show up in the region. We'd be a lot better off if we had a carrier battle group into the Mediterranean before we take action.
Well, we know this is already a very painful situation. Danielle, now that U.S. officials are saying that they found traces, every time I say it, I can't believe it because we look at those videos of those young children, traces of chlorine gas and an unnamed nerve agent. Now that we know that, how do you think that will advance the situation?
Well, obviously, it's important that we have proof of what happened. But I mean, let's all be real about this. The Assad regime has used chemical weapons. They've used nerve weapons before. And the reality is that they fall back on this legalistic definition of proof in order to slow us down, slow our momentum, and enable them to move their assets, enable them to consolidate their positions. This is really just tactical on their part. It's not like they care about the rule of law or international norms or the Chemical Weapons Convention.
Well, then, Danielle, what do you think about what Russia is doing today? Because it's Russia that requested this UN Security Council meeting. What game do you think they're playing, or what's their motivation here?
Look, the Russians are trying to separate the Europeans and the United States. They're trying to sow doubt in the minds of various countries around the world as to who was responsible for this. They're trying to buy time so that they can move their assets away from their port at Tartus. They're trying to buy time so that Assad can move his materials around so that it makes it more complex for us to begin to target those who were responsible for this terrible attack.
General, we know that the president likes to say I and I alone, but we've also learned that he spoke to French President Emmanuel Macron, who he has a good relationship with, and UK Prime Minister Theresa May last night. Do you think that there is a possibility that out of these conversations there could be some sort of coordinated effort here?
I think there will be. Certainly the French will take part. I notice the Germans have already said they won't take part in this attack. the Prime Minister of the UK is in political trouble. I'm not sure she's going to get concurrence out of her own government. So again, it's important that this not just be a U.S. military strike, but be part of a broader coalition, particularly NATO, and hopefully Arab allies in some form, that we're after Syrian armed forces' chemical warfare capability and not trying to strike against the Assad regime. This is a very difficult situation. I have great sympathy for Secretary Mattis, who does not want to see us ending up taking down the Russian presence in Syria. By the way, we've got to underscore, U.S. and NATO military power in the region is immensely more powerful than the Russians. So the bellicose language coming out of the Russian General Staff in Moscow is unsettling. What are they thinking of?
What are they thinking of? General Danielle, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us. I know you'll be back with us again, continuing to cover this complicated situation. I appreciate it. Coming up, it's my favorite part of the show, money, power, politics. Do you remember when President Trump said he would put country first? He would not be part of the Trump Organization. Well, attorneys for that very company, the Trump Organization, give the president of Panama an ultimatum. Help us.